move into another part of the partner experience, what the life is like when you're with a first responder, and some of the things that they're going to bring into the session with you. That's what all of this is about, right? Preparing you. So, one of the elements that has to really be explored is the concept and the sometimes burden of dealing with shift work. And some of this discussion absolutely is going to bleed into other professions or roles that you know that their partner has shift work as well. So, this can be helpful to just look at it from a lot of different angles. One element is we know, like from shift work, that there is a level of exhaustion that's attached here for the first responder. So that partner really has to kind of manage some of the spillover because it can impact their ability to function, right? So thinking, oh, they're done with this, the last 4 days, they're going to get off and they're going to help me. But if the last 4 days have been very full, that might not happen. So there's going to be spillover involved.
Absolutely. And I think just their overall level of functioning, right, is dependent on what happens throughout those days. Like you could have 4 days of 12-hour shifts and not a whole lot happen. Or, if you have firefighters, obviously they're working 24-hour shifts a lot of times. So, they're gone for the entire time. How much sleep they get depends on what's going on at the moment, right? So, there's a lot of different ways to look at the operational pieces of what's required in terms of the work level. And then, of course, when they come home, there's a decision between the family dynamic of how is that managed, right? For some people, they may stay on their shift work pattern of sleep. Others try to flip back and forth so they can spend more daytime with the family. So depending on how that happens, may depend on the effects on the family members. Oftentimes, and we're jumping a little bit here into intervention, I really would think about scheduling the sleep time when they get home. So, and having that known throughout the household. So, partner knows, children are aware. So we're allowing the first responder to get the rest they need, but also minimizing hopefully the effect on the rest of the family. So
yes,
speaking to
absolutely.
that, because that, as we flows into events as well.
Yes. Yeah, because the reality is they're going to likely miss events. Like they do not have control over their schedule many times. And so they don't have the ability sometimes to be home for holidays or events that they need to go through, whether it's childcare,
right?
birthdays,
Performance, right? Recitals, all of
yes.
those good things.
And if they've had days of being on without sleep, when they get off that next day, if there is something scheduled, that's really hit or miss. And that's a reality that just has to be acknowledged. They don't get the bliss of routine, right? Like some people will be like, oh, I'm in a rut. But then when you get out of the rut and you've been out of it for a while, you're like, I can't wait to have routine.
Yeah, just some structure, I think,
Yes.
to life is missing. And so you
Yes.
have to really be flexible and understand that things could change at the drop of a hat when
Yes.
somebody has that commitment to their profession and their career, where when they're called in, there's not really the opportunity to say no many times,
Yeah.
right? The whole family ends up having to have that flexibility.
Yes. So this is not an opportunity of like, oh, school's back in session. We go back into routine. It's not, they're not going to experience that often. And sometimes they are at just the mercy of scheduling in general. There are times where their week to week might look similar. They might work Tuesday to, Friday or Tuesday to Saturday. But the reality is, there are situations where it's not the case. They might be on for 3 and off for 2 and then on for 4. So like it's just gets very hard to appreciate that kind of routine. And for the partner, wanting to have some sense of normal predictability,
Right.
some sense of like we have some routine in this house. They tend to, unfortunately, they might fall into this trap of like, I'm going to schedule my life and you can schedule yours, and we do our thing. And if you show up, awesome. But if you don't show up, then that we understand it's your schedule. And while that logistically does work, the flip side of that is we're not really working as a unit or team or togetherness. It becomes you're living your life and I'm living my life.
Yeah, I think that engagement within the family can be
Oh, yeah.
sometimes feel excluded, right? Because you're just kind of fitting yourself in where you can. It reminds me a lot of military life, right? Where people are deployed or go TDY, and then all of a sudden they want to come back in and jump back into that role that they're used to
Yes.
having. But it takes both sides a little bit of transition to be able to fit back into that role and understand what works for everybody again. So again, this bringing up that communication piece of like figuring out how that's going to happen.
Absolutely. So psychoeducation, yeah, there's our foundation. We're always going to stand on that one, right? So about how the partner can care for themselves during the shift times. Like what are some plans, some strategies, even if it's sometimes brainstorming of what can be that additional support for them. And then also honoring the times that they are together. One of the things that I think really stands out is when you recognize what little time you have together, the time you do becomes very meaningful. It becomes very important to honor that time. So when they do have, let's say, a date night, when they do have a family gathering, they do get to go out to dinner together and no one's exhausted or being called to anything, and
Right.
nothing's there is this sense of prioritizing those moments. So there really can become some connection points where you go, let's if we can't have routine, which just might be the reality, right? If you can't have routine in some of these places, how can we then protect the time we do have together?
Yes, protect. I like that word. And there's a saying in couples counseling often where we use the rule of sevens. And right, every 7 days you go on a date of some sort, even if it's just an hour or two to spend together intimately so that you can have some conversation as adults. Every 7 weeks you spend a day together. And then every 7 months you try to get at least a night away together. So that doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can just be the two of you. Get babysitters, grandparents, whomever you might have. But that kind of brings us to the next part of like building that community, right? It is
Yes.
very tough to live this lifestyle alone. And sometimes people move to take on these positions.
Hmm.
And then, you don't have that external community. It really has to be built up. So looking for hobbies, organizations, spiritual
Yes.
organizations, right? Whether that be churches, synagogues, whatnot, whatever works for that family and they feel connected to might be a great opportunity in terms of intervention to build the community up to allow them some of that time to protect that time for themselves.
Yes. Love that. Another intervention that we want to discuss is the awareness component around coping with the culture, whether that is self-regulation techniques or kind of diving into some of the resilience components. We need to increase the awareness that you're not just coping with day to day, you're actually coping with some pieces that are very specific to this culture. And we want longevity, right? I always want longevity for our first responders in their role because I know it's important to them. But then I also want longevity for the dyad, whatever the family is, helping them, because I know that's also important to them. And so when we take time to say, hey, this is not just about dealing with day to day stress, we're also dealing with some of the cultural pieces of being a first responder and acknowledging it and building some awareness around how do we cope. So then, if we go back up to the idea of finding support during shift times, that's really specific to the culture. One of the things that probably is going to be a challenging thing to talk about, but is sleep and sleeping together, because as Allison just mentioned a little bit ago, that there's sometimes partners are on completely different sleep schedules so that they can even cover for childcare. So one might be getting up at a different time. One might be so you have alarms going off. So then we're really talking about quality of sleep.
Mhm.
And the reality is, there are times when then partners will sleep in different places.
Absolutely.
They don't have that physical closeness that we know actually brains respond to, right?
Good
When
oxytocin, right?
yes, they need that chemical response of closeness together and intimacy. And so that discussion about sleep and sleeping together is really helpful in exploring some of those pieces to make sure they're getting the most amount of support they can. All right, safety concerns. Like this one is a little bit more specific, I'd say, to law enforcement. However, it actually applies to all of our first
Absolutely. Yeah.
responders because there's risk involved everywhere. And for partners, we often see that they have this persistent worry, this in the back of their mind that their person is out in the world helping their community, but running towards danger, not
Right.
running
When everyone
away.
else is running away, they're running
They're
towards.
going towards
Right.
it.
And I,
So,
I agree. I think this one is throughout our branches, right? All first responders, EMS, firefighters, and our law enforcement. And then, even for dispatch, because I think persistent worry is not always just about their physical safety,
mhm.
but it's how is this role going to change my partner? Right, over
Oh,
time.
yes.
Because I think with the compounded trauma, the cumulative trauma that we talk about, over time, we recognize that it's going to have an impact on their overall personality or how they
Yes.
see the world in some way, or maybe even how they relate to the people in their lives. And so there's always this concern about, one, are they coming home
Mhm.
today? And that's a real valid worry. And then two, are they going to be the same person when they get home?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we want to recognize, we want to acknowledge that persistent worry. And we do also recognize that when the brain is constantly worried, when there's a persistent ongoing worry, it actually increases reactivity around anxiety.
Mhm.
So we do see anxiety disorders develop from that constant worry that's there in the background, constantly moving, right? So anxiety is a really common piece that can come up. Another piece is caution to others. So having people in the home, when you are recognizing that you're responding to some of these situations where you might not see the best of human behavior, you might not see the best of us. You're actually seeing someone on their absolute worst day. And so it can cause mistrust in general to others. And so having people in the home can be challenging. And I do, I know that this is might be a little more specific to law enforcement. Because if you think about a firefighter or an EMS responding, they're there, they're helping, they're like, being the hero. Whereas the law enforcement is really having to put some authority down and put some control
Mhm.
down. And so there is some difference there in how they might feel about others coming into their home. So feeling safe with others around their children, just coming to visit,
Even in public places, I would say, right?
even in public
So,
places, it
one
can
of the
happen.
things I see a lot with clients is this fear of what I would call like our big box stores, right? Places that are large, that have lots of people, that are very busy, being even in a
Hmm.
crowded restaurant,
Yes.
right? Feel that need to put your back to the wall and be looking at the door. You'll hear a lot of them talk about because there's a general mistrust of the public that's
Hmm.
developed, and whether that be law enforcement because they are the ones having to diffuse situations, or some of our other branches and just knowing bad things can happen in the world, right?
Yes.
That sense of hyperarousal, of hypervigilance tends to breed over time and
Hmm.
bleed into that personal world.
Oh,
Especially, we
yeah.
talked about that protector to partner, right? Sometimes they're feeling both, like especially with their family members, they want to make sure they are protecting them in a public place. And so you might find them being a little more concerned about the outside safety versus
Yes.
engaged in the family event or activity that's taking place. And so I
Absolutely.
think that's worth noting, that sometimes we have to just kind of recognize where we are internally and spend some time figuring out how we're going to manage that.
Yeah. And that's also really related to the concept of public perception. As we
Yes.
mentioned earlier, this kind of goes beyond the dangerousness of the job, but the scrutiny that comes with some of the role and the media.
Making
And
hard decisions, yes,
yes,
that are examined in every way now, especially with body cams
yes,
on, right? So there's a lot of fearfulness of even making a mistake.
yes, absolutely. And so that plays another level. When we think of the word safety, immediately we go to your physical safety. But the reality is, we can also, our brain also sees judgment as a threat to our safety, a threat to who we are. So when you feel like your family is being judged, your partner's being judged, it's really hard to watch your first responder dealing with that and thinking that's going to to, invoke in them some kind of hurt. So that safety of like your person, that partner can really feel that and experience that. So it's another element that we want to just acknowledge as their experience. So the biggest thing for intervention is validate the concern. Their risk is actually real. These are people that are running to danger. And so when the spouse says, I'm worried about them, that is a real concern because it's a real threat.
Right. And I think, kind of just again, acknowledging and understanding what it is that they are navigating each day, that's really the important part of seeing what their level of anxiety is in relation to some of these concerns that they might have.
Absolutely. This is another good time to, remind that the partner, hey, let's work on those self-regulation techniques, whether it's
Absolutely.
imagery, whether it's breathing, whether it's meditation. I spoke with a client the other day about, when anxiety hits, when fear hits, when that neurological pathway gets lit up from whatever concern or whatever trigger is happening that activates it, we often feel like we do not have any power. We're very helpless. We don't have any ability to influence it. But the reality is that you have a lot more empowerment than you realize. And that's around some of those breathing techniques. I have the power to slow my heart rate down. I have the power to move from my sympathetic nervous system into my parasympathetic. So empowering these individuals with those tools, that when they feel that way, they have something they can move into and start to promote that, what I call a new default. Like our old default is where we get worried, we get spun up and our hands sweat and we get, our chest gets tight and then it might start to get tearful and then it just kind of goes out of control. But the reality is we're going to create a new default together that when that happens, oh yeah, I have the power to then slow my body back down, slow those thoughts down.
Yeah, when you're talking about power, I always go back to locus of control, right? So it's that idea of, okay, what can I control? What can't I control? Let me focus on this one particular area because that's what's going to help me or allow me to feel less helpless, right? That these are the things I can do. There's nothing else I that's in my realm.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to focus my time and energy here. And I think when you are doing the psychoeducation piece on this, right, whether it be your relaxation strategies, your general self-regulation, validation, communication skills. We want to make sure that we're doing it as a team, right? So if you're sharing that with one part of the couple, you're sharing it with the other. So even individually, if I'm working with a client, maybe even on some relational pieces, but they are part of a dynamic, part of a team, I encourage them to share what they're learning, right? If they're feeling comfortable enough to share, okay, here's some skills that I've picked up on. Here's what you might see me practicing.
Yeah, don't keep it to
right?
yourself.
Right. Yeah,
share it everywhere.
We want to have as wide an impact as possible. And part of that is getting everybody the skills in the
Yes.
family. So, especially self-regulation techniques, right? Like that's the number one thing. We want everybody to kind of calm down, slow down. Communication skills then come into place, right? Where we can get the
Exactly.
communication going and the conversation started, and then hopefully come to some problem solving resolution.
Absolutely. Get the good pieces of the brain back online.
Right.
The last intervention is, we'd say, really create the community. This is really a time that we encourage other partners to connect to other partners, right? So that there is this sense of, yes, I feel that there's a validation, there's a sense of mutual respect, because we all recognize that this is a piece of the role and the culture. So this is a great place to really create community. One of our last sections for partner experience and really recognizing life with a first responder is house and parenting responsibilities. Like that's going to come up in every single couple that ever walks through the door, I feel like. So a lot of times they feel like the default partner because they're the one home. They're the one kind of attending to maybe school schedules or things that are happening in the home. And so a lot of these, that default and solo really go hand in hand. Not only do they feel like it's the default, it always goes to them, but also they can feel like at the same time, I feel like days I'm single parenting and I'm solo in this entire thing. And that might happen with mandatory overtime. That might happen when there's a crisis, shift work in general.
Off-duty work, if there's finances involved, right?
Yes. I feel like there's not a lot of people I've seen over the last few weeks that literally are working 6 days or more.
Yeah.
More.
Right.
There's only
Yeah.
7 days in a week, you know that, right? Like more. So that's oftentimes their partner is the person that is the default parent, and they're also solo parenting.
And they may be working as well. Right.
Yes,
Right. Yeah.
yes.
So it's a lot of
It's a
demands
lot.
on two partners that have to fill all of these
Yes.
roles and manage the responsibilities together. But I do always go back to, and I know we're getting to this point, within the unique perspective is they may feel that their role is vastly different from somebody else
Huge.
who's trying to maintain the same responsibilities.
Huge, huge difference. And so when they look at themselves in relation to peers, that's where, so remember, we got to go back to that isolation will come up, because then they look and go, well, my life looks
That
very
comparing.
different.
Yeah.
And when you do any type of social comparison, we know that it targets mood, it targets, so
Sure.
we tend to see anxiety and depression come up when we do social comparison and we fall short of what we see as either an ideal or a desired. But the division of labor in the house, it is often very common that the partner does willingly accept those responsibilities, acknowledging that this is part of the culture. So the division of the home labor in general, we really have to look wider beyond house and parenting, which typically when we work with couples, that would be something of like, hey, let's find equality inside of this. But with this population, we have to think of the division of labor as a little wider, the umbrella a little wider, because you also have to
Absolutely.
include mental labor.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
the wider umbrella that we always speak about, right, is because that umbrella underneath it looks very different for different couples,
Yes.
right? So, what might be very traditional for some couples or moving towards a more equitable distribution
Yes.
of division of labor, for some of these couples may not be possible.
Mhm.
And so, what does that look like? How can people pick up where they can? Some people have much more traditional roles within the dyad, and it may be someone's doing more childcare and in the homework or kitchen work, right, and one person's just providing and bringing in the money and the finances, or those might be more shared. And our role as providers is really to respect whatever it is that that couple feels works for them. And I think you and I have talked about how important not forcing our own thought process
Yes.
about what is
Yes.
equal or right for that couple. It's very important to allow them to work that out.
Absolutely. When we give that sensitivity and when we withhold our bias, which, when we think about the word bias, I think ethically, we always think of all these other elements, but really the way that we think life should be done is our
Right.
bias, right? So if we go, oh, well, he should be doing this or she should be doing this, when the word should comes in, there's your bias, right?
Right.
So we really want to honor whatever division of labor they have, and then also encourage them to find
Mhm.
where the divide should go.
And that leads us
Hugely.
right into the interventions, right? Of
Absolutely.
like really making sure that we're spending the time exploring, understanding, and getting a better sense of what the expectation is in the
Mhm.
relationship. Because, especially when it comes to that mental load,
Yes.
right, within the tasks, especially when it comes to the household tasks. Well, what does, grocery shopping, if that falls on one partner, does that mean they also make the list? Does it also mean that they make the dinners? Does it mean they make the lunches for the children for school? Right?
Mhm.
What does that include? Because there's a lot of work that goes into that behind the scenes before a meal shows up on a table.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, so those are the kinds of things that we need to get a little bit into the nitty gritty about, like
Mhm.
what the expectations are and have a better understanding of the interaction.
Absolutely. And again, the big element behind all of this when we talk about this category in general is really honoring the work of each.
Mhm.
Recognizing that it might not exactly be divided 50-50, or might not exactly be divided the way that you think it should be, but it's really honoring the work of each. Each person is working towards into the home, into the relationship, into the team.
Yes.
Each person is pulling their weight for the team in any way that they feel like the division of labor is equal for them.
And what might be a good metaphor that, right, is that we're working for the greater mission.
Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
we both have the same goal, the same mission, which is to provide for the family and to have everyone as happy and healthy as possible. And so when we're pouring in, there might be a daily transition that happens of who's doing
Hmm.
what. There might be a weekly, there might be a, lifelong expectation within the relationship. But as long as that works for them and everybody is feeling valued and
Yes,
appreciated for the work that they are putting in, then that typically leads to more satisfaction.
exactly.